If I ask you how many medieval works feature knights fighting giant snails, what will be your answer? 1? 2? Well, actually, a lot. Too many to be called a coincidence. If it actually happens a couple times in one country by one author, that could be coincidence, but it's not. Images depicting giant snails fighting knights are actually found throughout Europe, in England, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Austria. Most appear as marginalia in books. Marginalia are, as the name suggests, pictures drawn on the margin or edge of the page of a book. This picture here, for example, of a knight in full battle gear losing against a snail is from the Gorleston Psalter, a prayer book dated around the early 1300s. This is another example in the marginalia of Arthurian Romans, a 13th century French copy of the King Arthur story, in which a knight in full armor on horseback looked like he is beginning a charge against a snail. I don't actually remember that in the movie, but you know what they say, the book is always better. Not only are they abundant, but they actually span centuries. One of the oldest ones from the Rutland Psalter is from around 1260 and shows a knight or soldier visibly frightened fighting a giant snail with a blue shell. Meanwhile, one of the latest ones in Froissart's Chronicle is from 1470s Bruges. Here, a snail and a rabbit are apparently jousting against each other while riding. Humans? You can't help but wonder, why? Was there actually a giant species of now extinct snails during medieval times? Well, the only thing more surprising than finding giant snails in medieval works is the fact that no one is actually sure why. Now do keep in mind that this was a time when not everyone had access to stationery. Back then, only scribes used ink, and it was quite expensive. As such, surely the snail isn't just a mindless doodle. Well, historians have the answers, emphasis on the S. It's weird how such a simple question can have so many answers. Most historians believe the snail is a symbol. Symbol of what, you ask? Well, many different things. The most normal explanation is that it's a chivalry versus cowardice symbol. The snail is supposed to represent cowardice, while the knight is supposed to represent the chivalrous ideals. But if you look at some of the pictures, the knights are actually the ones cowering in fear. Wait, what? Well, it was a satire of some sort, in the sense that knights were supposed to be these brave and chivalrous soldiers, and yet they only took on foes who were weak. I mean, a snail is pretty low on the intimidation scale among other animals. In other words, knights who only conquered the weak, harmless foes like the snail were being mocked as cowards in knights' clothing. That's why a lot of the pictures show the knights on the losing end of the fight, some even visibly begging for their lives, and some begging to get their tunic back. Another explanation is that the snail is simply a representation of a hated ethnic group during the medieval era. Well, it was a different time in which people still hate each other for being from different ethnic, which we don't actually do anymore. An article published in 1962 suggests that the snail represents the Lombards, a Germanic people who live in northern Italy. The Lombard had a reputation for being usurpers, traitors, and cowards. But there's a problem with these explanations. The knights are losing. Like a lot in so many depictions. If they wanted the snail to represent the Lombard, surely the knights would be drawn as winning. That's one of the reasons why historians have doubts about these explanations, not to mention that there's no elements in the pictures referring to the Lombard people. Yeah, I can't really see the resemblance. In quite a similar way, the snail is also said to represent the lower classes' fight against the nobles. In medieval times, knights were a class of nobility wealthy enough to buy high-quality armor, weapons, and horses, while the snail was a lowly animal with little means to defend itself. And yet the snail is winning, which represents a kind of social struggle. The problem with these explanations is that the nobles were the ones commissioning most, if not all, of this work. Why would they pay to include a joke at their own expenses? But you could say that the artists were sneaking with little illustrations into the works, which kinda makes sense if you consider that many of the snail versus light depictions are marginalia, on the margins of the page, not in the main text. However, I think the biggest problem with this notion is that although the concept of social strata have always existed in medieval era, social struggle as a systemic phenomenon wouldn't be widespread for another 300 to 400 years. In medieval times, the concept of a social climber was largely limited to individual upstarts. To put it simply, the tension wasn't between classes per se, but rather on the fear that someone who was lowborn could become a part of the nobility class through favors and exploits. Think of a lowly soldier who slowly rises in the rank until he becomes a general, a position traditionally reserved for those with blue veins. So take the notions that the snail represent the lower class with a pinch of salt. It may be the case of some, but it can't be for the most of it. One of my most favorite explanations is that the snail represent death and resurrections. Yeah, you heard that right. You see, during a particularly dry season, a snail can seal itself away, seemingly die and dry up. But when it gets wet again, safe from the rain, it can re-emerge, seemingly having come back from the dead, similar to a certain public figure. But the allegory doesn't actually stop there. During medieval times, people believed that snails reproduce without sexual contact. So basically, they lock themselves up in their little shells and somehow little snails appear, similar to the public figure we just discussed. That's why it became a pretty obvious symbol for the birth of Christ. This, historians believe, is also the reasons why in Crivelli's altarpiece, which depicts the birth of Christ, there is a picture of a snail. It looks completely out of place in the scene, not only in the sense of what is a snail doing here, but also because the snail is believed to be Crivelli's attempt at breaking the fourth wall. If you look at the painting closely, it doesn't look like the snail is actually part of the scene, but rather gliding across the surface of the frame of the painting above the artist's signature. Another, rather simplistic but not entirely impossible reasons is that monks hated snails. Most of the snails appear in the marginalia of psalters or prayer books, such as this 15th century French prayer book. And these prayer books were likely written by monks. In addition to writing manuscripts, monks also tended to the monastery gardens, and snails were, and still are, a very common garden pest that can consume an entire garden in weeks, if not days. Being gardeners, this may have been their expressions of just how much they hated snails who eat at their cabbage. Lastly, many scholars suggest that maybe the snails don't have any meanings at all. It was all just a joke. As one modern commentator put it, perhaps a brave knight cowering from a harmless snail was simply funny 8 centuries ago, just as it is today. Put simply, it is a kind of absurd joke in the same way that the movie Airplane juxtaposed a serious situation with out-of-place and absurd interactions and events. The joke could have started with just one scribe, then another saw how funny it was and started doing the same. In that sense, this could very well be a form of a medieval meme, a very popular one that lasted for at least 3 centuries. So what do you think? Why do we have a lot of snails in a lot of medieval works?